All right, what's good, bitches? Today we are going to be summarizing Das Kapital Volume 1 for a podcast. Why did I do this? It was torture. First of all, it was torture. Oh my God, I spent like a month fucking doing this. But why did I do it? Because Das Kapital is so inaccessible for most people. There's a lot of people with ADHD. There's a lot of people learning disabilities. There's a lot of people that just can't access this book. And also, it's written within such a specific time period, with such specific time period, language, and references. But at the core of Das Kapital is an inkling of an analysis that is so universal to our current mode of production, and that is capital. Within Das Kapital, Marx set out to investigate what capital was, right? What really was the engine of capital, to break it up into its tiniest parts, to see how this machine moved, to see where this machine even came from, and to try to see where this machine was heading towards. That was Marx's goal with Das Kapital. It was to demystify capitalism, because capitalism, ladies and gentlemen, is so often mystified by our liberal economists who behold these gods like supply and demand, who say value is created simply through trade, who say that capitalism has always existed. That's my favorite one. Capitalism has always existed. It existed in ancient Roman times, and it existed as far back as humanity started, and it will always exist. Marx says bullshit, bullshit, bullshit to all of these basic assumptions, right? Capitalism developed specifically out of feudalism. It has this contradiction and that contradiction, and we're going to learn about those contradictions together as we explore the body of capital. And this is where it's heading, right? That was Marx's big goal with Das Kapital, Volume 1. So let's dive right into it. Commodity and value. Marx begins Das Kapital by saying that, quote, the wealth of these societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being the single commodity. Our investigation, therefore, must begin with the analysis of the commodity. So why is Marx talking about the commodity, and what even is a commodity? First of all, to Marx, the commodity was the most basic cell of the capitalist economy, right? A commodity is just something that's produced for exchange, right? And the reason that Marx chooses the commodity as the beginning point of his analysis, and most people can't get past chapter 1 within Das Kapital. It's the hardest one, most people say. I personally think that the most difficult chapters are in the middle, where he's going over Victorian labor reports. But the reason he chooses it is because he's building up his argument. He goes from the most basic cell of capitalism, the commodity, learns its laws, and builds up from there. Every single science textbook you have starts with what? The first chapter, the cell. Then it goes on to tissues, organs, et cetera, et cetera. In that same way, Marx is analyzing capitalism from its most basic cell. What is a commodity exactly? A commodity is something that is produced for exchange, right? So every commodity has two values. One is its use value. That's what the commodity is used for, right? A bong is for smoking weed. A TV is for scrolling on your phone while you watch Netflix. I don't know. Everything has a use value. A shovel is for digging, yada, yada. And exchange value. So commodity has two values. The second value is exchange value. Exchange value is how much money you can make off of it. Moolah, cash, dinero, et cetera, et cetera. So let's say you make you're a glass blower and you make a bong for your friend. You give that bong to your friend for free. Is that a commodity? No, because you didn't give it away for exchange. You gave it away for free to your friend. But let's say you make that same bong and you sell it at your weed shop to other people. Then is it a commodity? Yes, because you are making this item that serves a human need for exchange. So that's what a commodity is. And Marx spent page after page after page trying to explain this in the first chapter of Capital, and most people fall off right there. Even Marx himself said that the first chapter of Capital is the hardest later on in introductions to Capital. So the value of a commodity comes from socially necessary labor time. And specifically, this general law has been dubbed labor theory value, right? So socially necessary labor time is the amount of time. Labor theory value is the overarching theory. Labor theory value is basically the acknowledgement that everything humans have ever used in order to create wealth requires human labor, right? And it's a very old idea. It was used by Adam Smith. It was used by David Ricardo. If you don't know who these people are, they're very classical capitalist economists. They're some of the world's first economists, in fact. The first famous major economists, in fact. There were economists before them, but the first major famous ones. And in fact, capitalism is one of the first times that economies actually started to become studied really heavily. So labor theory value just asserts that the average amount of time across an industry, which is the socially necessary labor time, that it takes to make something determines its value, and what is made has to be actually needed or wanted by society. So what does that mean? That basically means if across the entire industry, it has to be the average time across the entire industry. If it takes 1 minute to make a burger, that is going to determine the value of the burger, right? If a new fangled machine comes along that cuts the time to 30 seconds, the value of the burger is going to drop. That's basically it, right? The standard is the average time across the industry, a minute. If you suddenly are able to be a super fast worker and, create burgers in 30 seconds, right, thanks to this newfangled machine, the value of the burger drops immensely. Marx called the average amount of time across the industry socially necessary labor time. LTV is the overall arching theory. So I just need to emphasize that a lot of people get it mixed up. Even I got it mixed up at first. So let me give you another example, right? Just to really get into your head. So let's say I'm trying to make a table, right? Across the entire industry, the table making industry, it takes people 4 hours to make that table. I make that table in 15 minutes because I'm not that good at making tables, and so I just scramble something together. My table is going to be worth a lot less than the tables that took 4 hours to make. And that is because the value of my table is being measured against the value of the entire industry. What is creating that value within this wood that I'm transforming into a table? That is human labor power. So Marx realized that value comes from human beings, human labor power, not trade, not, this is what capitalism does, right? It mystifies the market. So often they'll say, almost all value from the capitalism comes from trade, this, that, no, no, no. It comes from human labor power. Now, there's a lot of critics of labor theory of value, libertarians, right? And none of these libertarians understand really what labor theory value is, right? So a common talking point that they will have is, well, if I spent 200 hours making a mud cake under Marx's labor theory value, that 200-hour mud cake would be worth $1 million, something like that, right? No, no, no. Labor theory value only works for a commodity that is desired and fills a human need. You can't just spend unnecessary labor making some unnecessary shit that nobody wants. It's not going to contribute any value to that commodity. Marx insisted that value was not simply the time it took for an individual to make something, but the time it would take an individual working across the entire industry, right? So that's the second issue, right? So these libertarians will say, well, if I make $500 hours spent making a pizza, that pizza is going to be worth a lot more. No, you're being compared to the average across the entire industry. Now, if you created a machine, right, that standardized across the entire industry, making pizzas a lot faster, then it would drop significantly. And if that machine got adopted across the entire industry, then the value would drop, right? So it's always measured across the entire industry. Value is a measurement of a social relation amongst people, which assumes a material form and is related to the process of production, right? So value, and by the way, the notes that I'm using, I'm going to link them down in the description below so you can get them also. They're publicly available on my Substack. Value under capitalism, it does not measure this metaphysical thing that the capitalist economists often wanted to. Value measures human relations, people making things, the guy who pulled out the oil out of the ground, the guy at the refinement factory, the guy who drove it in the truck. That is what goes into value, all these human social relations, and they're hidden from that value. When you see it in the store, they're all hidden behind value. An increase in productivity means less socially necessary labor time to make a good, which then lowers value. And then if across the entire industry, for whatever reason, it takes more socially necessary labor time to make a good, the value goes up. That could happen theoretically. It usually doesn't. Capitalism is incentivized to do this because of competition, to lower the value and make itself more productive. And because it lowers the value of socially necessary labor time across the entire industry, it also means that they have to pay workers less, right? So if they're the less amount of a worker's own work is going into making a product, they typically have to pay workers less because they're able to offset it more. They're able to make workers produce more at a time. So workers end up getting paid less the more industries become autonomized, automatic. Therefore, if usually across an entire industry, it took like a minute to make something, you get it down to 20 seconds, it's going to drop hella. That's all you need to understand. You got bong, you got weed, it usually takes you like an hour to make that bong. You bring it down to like 20 minutes across the entire industry, the bong prices are going to drop like hella. It's going to be a lot more affordable, but also you're going to get paid a lot less in the process. So it evens out in some kind of way. Labor is not the only source of value. Okay? Labor is not the only source of value. Nature provides a use value such as air, water, sunshine. Marx acknowledged that. Marx acknowledged that labor is not the only source of value. However, labor is special because it's the only thing that can add value to something. Labor can take raw materials, let's say like latex, right, and make a fleshlight. I don't know. It can take something that is worth less and create something that's worth more. It can take raw products and create something that's worth more. It can impart its value in that process of taking something that's worth less and more. Labor, for example, you take a wood, you make that super nice table, you've imparted value onto it. That is what's so special about labor. Then that is what's so special about labor power. Now, labor and labor power, Marx noted, are different. Labor power is what you sell to a capitalist, right? Labor power is your ability to do work, right? It's your theoretical ability to do work. And this is what you negotiate with a capitalist in your contract, right? I'll be able to do this much work. Okay, I'll give you this much wage, right? That's labor power. Labor is the actual work that you do. Okay, so that's how Marx abstracted labor and labor power. He is a Hegelian. He loves abstractions. I know people are already in the comment section saying, well, Marx wasn't a Hegelian. He used Hegelian frameworks. Okay. He flipped Hegel on his head, but he used Hegelian frameworks. All right. In that sense, he was a Hegelian, right? There is no Marx without Hegel. And Das Kapital is full of Hegelian abstractions and contradictions. It's Marx just applying Hegel's method to capital in so many ways, though from a materialist framework. What is value even? Like, is value the same as price? You may be asking. Value is not the same as price. Value is the base cost of a good, right? So communists, we don't deny supply and demand as a market mechanism. Supply and demand does exist, but a commodity can fluctuate due to supply and demand, but the price it always fluctuates around is value, right? So a market can make a commodity's price go up, a commodity's price go down, right? But when it's going up, when it's going down, when it's going up, when it's going down, the price it's always trying to stabilize around is value. Value is that true hidden cost in the commodity that the market is always trying to get towards, right? So think about it like this. People in California, right? They're always buying houses, and houses in California are always going crazy, right? During a market crash, a house might be $600,000. During a market high, a house may be $2 million. But when people go to the bank for a loan, the bank only covers $800,000, right? The bank, when it's only covering $800,000 for the mortgage, is covering the value, the true underlying cost of the house that the market is always trying to reach, that's always trying to orient itself towards during its highs, during its lows. The price that the people are paying is what the market is trending towards at that moment, whether it's $700,000, which is way lower than the value, so they got a good deal, or what, $2 million, which is way higher than the value, and they got a pretty shitty deal. Yeah, buying a house in California is a mess anyways. Don't even try. I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it. Anyways, value is ultimately a measure of hidden social relations, right? Like what I was talking about before. When you go to Walmart and you look at that toy, you don't see the men who worked out to pull the oil. You don't see the sweatshop factories that assembled it. All you see is the toy. When you go to the iPhone Apple stand, you don't see the blood of Congolese slaves that mined lithium in order for the battery to function. When you go to the chocolate aisle in Walmart, you don't see the blood of cocoa slaves within West Africa. All you see is the product, right? The product sort of takes on a life of its own, right? It's completely disconnected from all this human exploitation that which was taken in to make it. Marx dubbed this the commodity fetish. Fetish here is the older definition of fetish. It's not that beating your meat, oysters. What other aphrodisiacs? What's a good aphrodisiac? Oysters, right? What other aphrodisiacs are there? Hold on, I'm gonna go search one up. Garlic is an aphrodisiac? Who the fuck are you guys dating? Vampires? Anyways, it's the older definition of the commodity fetish, which means idolatry, right? So it's like that power that idols were given under pagan religions, right? And in that sense, what Marx is saying is we worship commodities under capitalism. We give them these mystical, magical powers, and yet these magical, mystical powers hide the true human relations and costs that were taken in order to create them. Right? Slaves within Congo, slaves within cocoa farms in West Africa. That is the commodity fetish, is the inability to see the true human costs and relations within a product. And that is all commodities are. Commodities are just representations of various human relations and interconnectedness, and yet capitalism tries to veer us away from it, from being able to see it. Money, capital, and circulation. So Marx answers what money is very easily, right? Marx has to analyze money just as much as he does the commodity. Money is a commodity that is a universal measure of value for all other commodities. So as Marx said, money is, quote, the commodity that functions as a measure of value and is either in its own person or by a representative as a medium of circulation, end quote. So money is two things under capitalism. It is an ideal measure of value, meaning it represents socially necessary labor time embodied in commodity, and it acts as a store of value. So, value can be stored within it, especially for all the surplus value and whatnot created within a society. So ultimately, Marx traced the origin of money back to barter, right? So before humans had money as a universal measurement of all things, people would have to exchange two things of equivalent value, right? So if I had 200 bongs and you had some flashlights, or I don't know, you had wheat or something, and we wanted to exchange an equivalent rate, we would have had to figure out some way to figure that out. We would have had to get the right weights. It would have been a mess, right? I have to find the right amount of weight that is worth grain. It doesn't really work that cleanly. And money came along as a universal symbol of value, and easier mode of exchange. In Marx's time, that sort of universal value was backed by gold, right? The gold standard, which had become sort of a universal equivalent and a way to transfer value easily. These days, the dollar is just backed by trust in world governments, which is cool, I guess. Money being a commodity means it rises and falls in value, correlated with the amount of value produced within a society, right? And Marx saw the birth of exchange value in trade between ancient communities, right? Which would create things for use, but then trade with foreign peoples. When people stopped creating things for their own immediate community and started focusing on creating things for other communities, that is when exchange value was first created. And if you notice, that's way before capitalism. So a lot of the things apparent within capitalism, right? A lot of the tools, exchange value, even capital itself, some forms of capital, which we'll go into, have existed long before capitalism. But they have instead been simplified and reproduced to a whole new level. But a lot of these general trends have existed since forever, but they under capitalism have become simplified, expedient, overproduced, things like that, brought to a whole new scale. Whereas before they existed on the fringes of economies and were not the main drivers of economies whatsoever. Marx traced two important circuits within capitalism, right? And that was how commodities and monies were circulated in the economy. And these two circuits were CMC, which is commodity, money, commodity. And basically, commodity, money, commodity is just the life cycle of how money circulates, right? So you are a worker, you sell your labor power on the market. Labor power under capitalism is a commodity, right? You get money, you buy a new commodity, or you're a business, you have like a laptop or something, you sell it, you buy with that money more commodities, more laptops to sell. That's the first circuit of capital. However, Marx pointed out that money can be exchanged very quickly in this circuit, right? So in commodity, money, commodity, the commodity might sit around your shop for a while, right? So that laptop may sit around for your shop for a while. It may not do anything. That money goes fast. Money you can buy almost immediately new things with. And so this basically, right, the disparity between how fast money can go versus a commodity, which may need to sit around for a while before it finds the right buyer, really disproves free market liberals' ideas in that perfect free economy where the exact amount of commodities are produced and they're distributed to the right amount of people at the right price. It's all bullshit. And this also is one of the big reasons the commodity, money, commodity circuit, why economic crashes so often happen, because a lot of the times more commodities are produced within that circuit than can actually move quickly enough. And so warehouses sit full of commodities that nobody buys or really wants. And during market bubbles, this bursts. The other circuit is money, commodity, money prime. This is the formula for capital. It's basically just money, commodity, more money. Capital is money that makes more money. Capital cannot just be money sitting around the bank. So let's say you're a capitalist, you have some money, you buy a commodity like a person's labor power, and therefore you make a PS5, right? They take a bunch of digital hardware and they make a PS5. You sell that PS5 to market, you have made more money with the original money, right? There was a little step in between, but at the end of the process, you have made more money. And you put that money back into the circuit, right? You hire out even more people to make PS5s and you get more money. You hire out more people to work for you, you get more money. Or you buy more raw materials to turn into PS5s and you get more money as you sell them on the market. So a capitalist has money, he hires that labor, he makes more money. This leads to a never-ending beast, a never-ending circuit. This leads to infinite growth under capitalism. The capital circuit is so dangerous, and it is one of the main drivers of capitalist modes of production. As capitalists reinvest their money back into exploiting more and more and more people as they can, getting more and more labor power, which is the major source of value. Um, it leads to infinite growth within a finite world. It leads to imperialism as capitalist companies and countries seek to find new markets in which they can export their capital into to exploit even more people to get more money, or expropriate more resources to get more money. And this never-ending circuit, what it does is it reinvests dead labor back into living labor. So as Marx said, capital is dead labor, right? It's past people's value that is re-added to the circuit, right? It is dead labor that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labor and lives more and more the labor it sucks. The time during which the laborer works is the time during which the capitalist consumes the labor power he has purchased from him. So once again, capital is not just money sitting in the bank. You're the dude at the bar bragging about how he has 30K sitting around the bank. It's not capital. He's not a capitalist. Capital is in that circuit. Capital is a tool of leverage, control, and exploitation of other people. It is within a circuit in which it is reinvested in order to make more money over and over and over again, in which a commodity is bought in between either labor power, so a human laborer, or, raw materials. So, or it can be both, So capital is not a thing, but a social relation between persons. It is a tool of leverage, a tool of control. Its goal is mere exchange value, which is all capitalists are interested in. Its goal is not use value, right? So this leads to a great contradiction, right? Under capitalism and under any system, workers and the masses in general, right? The bottom classes are interested in the use value of a commodity. A home is for living in, a phone is for calling, a food is for eating. But capitalists are only worried about, especially since there's a commodity circuit that they constantly have to obtain to. And if they stop within this commodity circuit, this capital circuit, in addition to that, the both circuits, the commodity and capital circuit, if they stop that, they stop being a capitalist and they get outcompeted with. All they are interested in is exchange value, right? Exchange value. And the dangerous thing about exchange value is that it's so often precedent. It so often takes precedent. In fact, under capitalism, it always takes precedent over use value. And this is why we end up with 600,000 homeless people and yet 12 billion empty homes within America. This is how we end up with America being the most richest country on earth with more than enough food to feed everybody within this country and 32 million people going hungry. Because our mode of production, capitalism, is geared around exchange value and the capital circuit and nothing else. It is not geared towards use value. It's not geared towards actually using these commodities. It is geared towards producing these commodities as fast as possible to reinvest more money into that capital circuit. So as Marx says, the expansion of value is the mainspring of the circulation, MCM, and it becomes capitalist's subjective aim. It is only insofar as the appropriation of ever more and more wealth in abstract becomes the sole motive of his operations that he functions as a capitalist. Use value, therefore, must never be looked upon as the real aim of the capitalist. The restless, never-ending process of profit-making alone is what he aims at. Right? And this is not a personal moral failure of a capitalist. This is a systemic failure that the system gears every single capitalist towards. That's very important to point out. And if a capitalist stops that capital circuit, he stops being a capitalist. He gets outcompeted by his competitors. And therefore, it leads to that vicious competition and never-ending growth. In the formula for capital, MCM prime, Marx talks about a soul being transferred from one object to another. Quote, money is changed into commodities and by scale of those commodities is reconverted into more money, end quote. The soul he's referring to is human labor and the relations hidden in this formula. Capitalists often argue that profit doesn't come from workers, but instead circulation. Marx expertly showed that it comes from human labor power, and it is mystified under the capital circuit, it is mystified under the price. It's so many aspects of our own expropriation, our own exploitation is mystified under capitalism, including our paychecks. Labor power, wages, and surplus value. So within capitalism, again, workers sell their labor power to a capitalist in exchange for wages. Labor power is your ability to do work. It's your theoretical ability to do work. Labor itself is the actual act of working. So when you're entering into a negotiation with your boss, whether you realize or not, you're negotiating with them and the entire market and everybody else on the market. You're competing with them. You are negotiating with your ability to produce value for your boss through your labor power. And then in that sense, labor itself is a commodity with a use value, creating a good or doing a service, right? So you enter into your relationship with your boss. The use value is, you're able to create a commodity, or you're able to do a service for him, hotel maid, something of that sort. And in exchange value on the marketplace. Now, within the capitalist equation of labor, there is this thing called surplus value. Everyone on earth fundamentally understands what surplus value is without having the exact words to exactly say it. You think of the phrase, boss makes a dollar, I make a dime. That's why I shit on company time, right? Or poop on company time. When a worker clocks into work, let's say, right? A bong factory. With his labor power, he makes $3,000 worth of bongs, right? So on that day, with your own two hands, you're blowing glass and you've blown out $3,000 worth of glass with your own two hands. However, when the week ends and you go to collect your paycheck, there's only $300 on your paycheck. You made with your own two hands over the entire week $3,000, but you only got $300 on your paycheck. Where did that $2,700 go? To the capitalist, to the head honcho, to the man upstairs, and that is surplus value. What got stolen from you is surplus value. and that goes right into the capital circuit. His goal is to exploit as many workers as possible. The more workers that a capitalist can hire out and exploit, the more value he's able to create, right? So that's always the goal. Labor power, being a commodity, inherently leads capitalists towards seeing workers as nothing more than commodities themselves. You are nothing but a beast of burden that needs just the meagerest amount to survive, right? So since you are not a machine, you still need sleep, you still need a roof over your head, and you still need food in your stomach, right? Otherwise, the capitalist would make you work 24 hours if he could. But since you are not a machine and you can't work 24 hours and you have some needs, a capitalist pays you subsistence wages. A subsistence wage is the lowest and the only necessary wage rate that is providing for the subsistence of the worker for the duration of his work, and is much more as is necessary for him to support a family and for the race of laborers not to die out, end quote. So you'll notice that a lot of jobs don't have a subsistence wage. That's because of labor history, labor struggles. But capitalism, if there was no such thing as unions and people fighting against the system and communists and socialists, would always tend towards a subsistence wage, and is always trying to tend towards a subsistence wage, which is the least amount it can give you in order for you to survive. And in fact, it would prefer to tend towards zero, right? If it would prefer you were like a machine that doesn't even need any food and is just able to produce value 24/7 for it. So basically, under capitalists are incentivized to not only see workers as anything but machines of labor, but are also incentivized to only give workers the bare minimum amount to wage for them to be able to recover after a long day of work. Because of this, everyone's workday is split into two parts, all right? Because of surplus value, your workday is split into two parts. The first few hours where you make your own wages, right? So that time when you were blowing the bong, the $300 you saw in your paycheck at the end of the week, and the last few hours of your workday where you're making your boss's wages, right? So the $2,700 that went to your boss's wage, even though you're the one who made them, right? So as Marx said, therefore, quote, capital is not only the command over labor, it is essentially the command over unpaid labor, because so much of your workday is unpaid, but you don't even realize it. It's mystified through your paycheck. You don't even realize the wealth that's being stolen from you. All surplus value is in substance the materialization of unpaid labor. The secret of the self-expansion of capital resolves around into having the disposal of a definite quantity of other people's unpaid labor, end quote. So part of your workday is spent making money, not even for yourself, but the guy upstairs, right? A good part of your workday is spent not even improving your own life, but somebody else's life. Your CEOs, Jeff Bezos's, Mark Zuckerberg's, Bill Gates, Elon Musk's, right? I used to know a guy who worked in a Tesla factory, big conservative guy, and every single day he made money for Elon Musk, even though he supported Elon Musk. I mean, that's that's what we're socialized into being, right? And he said the job was miserable, right? He was stapling seats onto a Tesla, but he still loved the guy. I don't know. I don't know. That's just what capitalism does. You know, it mystifies everything and makes you a slave to the system. And it gives you the ruling class's ideas as your own. So, right. So let's say you have an 8-hour workday. The first 3 hours are spent making value, right? You're the main source of value within capitalism. You're not the only source of value. Nature also produces value, but you're the main source of value. Let's say the first 3 hours are spent making the value that you're going to see in your paycheck, right? And the rest of the 5 hours are spent making the value your boss is going to see, right? That Elon Musk collects and puts into his capital circuit, right? So the amount of hours in your workday that you spend making your own paycheck, Marx called that necessary labor, right? Because necessary labor, isn't that such a great term? That's a necessary labor. Because for us, that is necessary, right? That's the money. That's the only money that matters to the working class. And the rest of the workday that you spend making your boss's money, surplus labor, right? And necessary labor and surplus labor are always in a tug and pull. Capitalists are trying to make your necessary labor as short as possible. The amount of your workday that you spend actually making your own wage as short as possible, and the amount of your workday where you spend making the capitalist wage as long as possible. So surplus labor as long as possible. And that tug and pull, and this is one of the many tug and pulls under capitalism. Have you noticed them already? You've got exchange value and use value. That's one tug and pull. That's one contradiction that's just waiting to burst eventually. You've got surplus labor versus necessary labor. That's another tug and pull. That tug and pull often incentivizes capitalists to extend the workday as much as possible, because the more hours they can get you to work, the more surplus value they can get out of you, the more surplus labor you're doing for them, and the less necessary labor you're doing for yourself. The struggle over the working day is between the capitalists seeking to vastly extend it so that workers spend more time doing surplus labor, and workers who want a shorter day because, well, duh, nobody wants to work long hours. And, you know, having a shorter working day is nice. Seeing your family is nice. So, our fight against capitalists, why are they trying to keep us working such long hours? A lot of the times, it's just because they want more surplus labor within our workday, less necessary labor, the time we spend making our own paycheck. So, during Marx's time, people used to work 12 hours, sometimes more than 12 hours, which is fucking insane within factories. It was only recently because of the struggle of the working class that we got 8 hours, right? So the natural tendency of the market is to give us as long hours as possible. We've managed to draw them back thanks to the labor movement. Even recently, people like Google's ex-CEO Eric Schmidt, Elon Musk, etc., have all supported extending the workday. So you can see as capitalism enters into crises, they're starting to say, you know what, let's get rid of the 8-hour workday, yada yada. Do we really need 8 hours? You can see the capitalists already foaming to get more surplus value out of us and shorten our necessary labor. How do capitalists even find workers willing to sell their labor power to them, right? How does this relationship even get created? It gets created over decades, over centuries, right? The peasants and the working classes had to be stripped of all personal property and all means of production, and had all means of production, all personal property had to be concentrated into the capitalist hands. This is called primitive accumulation, and we'll go more over it later on. I just want to give you a little teaser of that. Only by creating a system where there's a mass majority of humanity that has no private property and a small percentage of humanity that has private property was capitalism able to create a massive humanity whose only commodity it had left was its labor power. And once the only thing you have left is your own body and your own ability to do work, then you're willing to sell your labor power to a capitalist. So this is all the beginnings of the crux of class conflict, right? Under capitalism, a capitalist desires to keep wages as low as possible. A worker's is to get them as high as possible. So, right, this is another contradiction. This is another tug and pull under capitalism. The mass of surplus value is a fun one. This is the total amount of surplus value capitalist gets from all of his workers, right? So surplus value is the value you get from one worker. Mass surplus value is the value you get from all the workers in a factory, all the workers on your farm, all the workers, yada, yada. Right. So under capitalism, what generally happens is that workers sort of become one amalgamous blob, right? You have workers who are super proficient and able to create a lot of value. You have workers who are super bad at their job and not able to create that much value. They sort of all average out, right? The more people you have within your factory, the less it matters the differences in between them, or within your workplace, within your company, yada, yada. I don't know, the CEO of Tesla factory, there you go. So there are general laws about mass surplus value, right? Massive surplus value. The basic formula of it is average labor power times the number of workers. And it reveals a couple things about capitalism, right? The first rule is that profits and how many workers capitalists have hired are tied. So the more amount of workers that capitalists have, the higher profits are, the more value you're able to extract, et cetera, et cetera. If a capitalist fires a bunch of workers, he has to make up for it by exploiting the remaining amount of workers more, right? So let's say your coworkers were all let go and you're the only one left in KFC. Suddenly you're going to start working 2-hour shifts. I mean, not 2-hour shifts, 12-hour shifts, right? You're going to start working double shifts, triple shifts, quadruple shifts, because there's less mass of surplus value for them to extract. All right. So in addition to that, capitalists must always have a certain number of workers within their company for them to be able to be profitable. Because if they kept on firing workers and mass exploiting the remaining ones, they would eventually run into biological limits, right? People need sleep, people need to go home, people need to refresh, and eventually the amount of work that they would require out of like the dwindling amount of workers would end up going past 24 hours, right? So there's a limit to how many people capitalists need to hire in order to make profit, in order to create value. And there's a maximum in which they often end up overhiring and then, horrible market crashes and mass firings and things such as that. And then finally, 3, the more workers capitalists hire, the more surplus value that they get, right? No, that's a simple one. Capitalists often find themselves trying to reduce the number of workers that they have to save money on variable capital, right? So even though more workers equals more surplus value, there's also a short term within the capitalist exchange. There's also short-term profits that have to be considered. So hiring a lot of workers makes long-term profits, but there's also short-term quarterly profits that have to be considered. And this is variable capital. Variable capital is the money you pay to workers for their wages, right? So that's the part of the capital circuit that goes towards hiring labor, that goes towards getting wages and exploiting workers in order to extract the surplus value. And since capitalists are trying to reduce the amount of money they spend on variable capital, they a lot of the times end up firing workers, right? Oh, we've overhired our workers. We got to fire them. You're the only one left in the KFC. You're working triple shifts now. It's such a shitty thing. Piece wages are one of the most dastardly things under capitalism. Piece wages are where you basically get paid per piece that you produce, right? You can think of the gig economy, DoorDash, Uber, per delivery that you make, per person that you pick up and drop off. And piece wages are dangerous because the more pieces that begin to get produced across a shorter amount of time across an industry, the lower generally wages get. So the more that workers become productive, the more that they intensely work and the more that across the entire industry it becomes automated and all that, and the more productive it gets, the more pieces are essentially produced, the lower the wages start becoming. As Marx said, piece wages are lowered in the same proportion as the number of pieces produced in the same time as they arise, and therefore the working time spent on the same piece falls. Right, so you can sort of think of like in the heyday of Uber Eats or DoorDash. People were making bank, people are making good. Suddenly, a lot of people get in. It gets faster. People get better at doing it, and suddenly there's not that much money to be made in Uber Eats anymore. There's not that much money to be made in DoorDash anymore, as in the golden days when I used to deliver Uber Eats. And I would deliver it to the wrong houses because I was very bad with addresses, and I would just eat it sometimes when I got really bored. I was not a very good Uber Eats delivery driver. Basically, the more the worker works in the piece wage industry, and the more that they create per piece, the lower their wages per unit become. This change in piece wages, so far purely nominal, leads to constant battles between capitalists and labor. Either because capitalists use piece wages as a pretext for lowering the price of labor, or because increased productive power of labor is accompanied by an increase in intensity of labor expended. Basically, piece wages lead to a constant battle between your boss. He will use piece wages to make you work harder than you usually would with more intensity, or he can decide that the unit that you produce was not actually good enough and withhold your pay. So you're an Uber Eats delivery driver. Uber Eats arbitrarily decides, I'm not going to pay you for this Uber Eats delivery, and you lose your wage. That happens all the time. Um, because the labor takes seriously the appearance of piece wages, right? Because workers often take these piece wages as actual being paid per their hard work, rather than them being exploited and basically being paid along the same structure as normal wage labor, but it's hidden behind the piece unit producing sort of a grind set. Because workers often take that grind set culture that comes with piecework, Uber Eats, DoorDash, Uber, because they take it seriously and they are not able to demystify it. Um, they are unable to see that they are being exploited at a hyper level, which comes with lowering wages, which has come with lowering in the selling price of the commodity, et cetera, as they are able to produce more and more. Marx made a very poignant point that capitalists buy all commodities before they're below their value in order to make a profit, and that includes labor power. So your wage is bought way below its value because if he bought it above its value, he would not make profit. Labor power is then taken as a surplus, right? The price that he bought it at is lower than the actual value. The rest of the value he uses for himself. He takes for himself in the form of surplus, puts it into the capital circuit, gets more money out of it, hires more workers, gets more money out of it, hires more workers, and buys more materials. That's the goal. Marx also pointed out that wages are very good at hiding the true value somebody has produced in a day. Everyone under capitalism produces more value than they see in their paycheck, with the rest of the value going towards their boss. And finally, labor power has a very important use value. It's the only thing, well, it's one of the only things that can take raw materials and impart its value onto them, right? That can create value. Labor power is one of the only things that can create value. Nature can also create use values, but labor power can impart it and create more, right? So nature can produce rocks and woods and trees, but labor power is the only thing that can turn those rocks and woods and trees into tables, PS5s, cars, I don't know, what else. Um, as Marx says, the fact that this same labor is universal, value-creating element, and thus possesses a property by which it differs from all other commodities, is beyond the cognizance of the ordinary mind. Wages are also in a tug of war with the amount of people within the reserve army of labor, right? So the amount of people that are unemployed. So within capitalism, you have labor power, you sell it on the market. You're constantly in competition with other people who also have labor power, which generally tends to drive wages down because there's always somebody who's willing to do less work, more work for less wages than you. And also because there's a reserve army of labor, because there's unemployed people who will take half your wages in order to just survive, eat, etc. Intensity of labor, if increased, can create more value. So this is one of the ways that if a capitalist can't extend your workday, if they can't make you work 12 hours instead of 8, if they cannot do that, they can just make you work more intensely in those 8 hours. This creates more surplus value for capitalists, right? So this can be done artificially through squeezing workers of every last ounce of productivity that they have. Think of Amazon employees who sit in warehouses for so long, shipping these boxes that they have to pee in bottles. Amazon is trying to squeeze all intensity of labor out of them in those short 8 hours that they have them with, so that they can get as much surplus value as they can out of them. The more productive labor is made, the more the workday can be shortened. But it won't be because the balance between necessary labor and surplus labor. So we could live in a world where most people could only work 4 hours a day. We've reached that level of productivity. The more productive labor is made, the more the workday could be shortened. But under capitalism, this is all done for exchange value, not use value, including your labor power. So you're not going to be able to go home. You're going to work those extra hours to create that surplus for the capitalists. You're going to expend more surplus labor and spend less time with your family, kids, friends, etc., hobbies. As Marx says, quote, in capitalist society, spare time is acquired for one class by converting the whole lifetime of the masses into labor time, right? So capitalists get spare time by converting your time into labor and value. Just like a house on the market, Marx asserted that labor power's real price, wages that we are paid, cannot be determined by supply and demand because it is always tending towards a true hidden value. The goal in the rise of wages, variable capital, or the amount of money you get paid, grows with constant capital, or the amount of productive forces within a society. So what is variable capital and what is constant capital? Variable capital is the capital spent on hiring out workers, right? Paying their wages. This is the capital that can create value, right? Constant capital is the money spent on hiring machines, buying means of production, right? What the workers are going to use to create commodities, right? And basically, buying more constant capital makes workers more productive, which over the short term, yes, does lower their socially necessary labor time, does lower the amount of value that they produce. But if you can produce more commodities rapidly, fast enough, you're able to offset this by creating more commodities and selling them, right? So because of more machinery and automation and productiveness you have, the more capital you generate that you have available, even if more gets spent on machinery. However, the issue is that it's not a direct relation, right? The more constant capital grows, or the more industry grows, or the more machinery grows, the more it takes for a rise in wages, right? So the more automated a society gets, the slower wages rise. So, wages can rise relatively quickly if a society goes from, peasant, feudal, no factories to factories. Wages can rise very fast. But if you're going from like iPhone 10 to iPhone 12, right? You've already reached an amazing level of industrialization. It takes a lot longer for wages to rise within that variable capital, constant capital cycle. Keynesianism offset this issue of productivity and variable capital, right? The issue between constant capital and variable capital. It offset it temporarily by having wages tied to productivity, which stabilized capitalism for a little bit, right? From the 50s to about the 80s. But it couldn't do it forever. It could not do it forever. Remember, capitalism has so many little tugs and pulls, so many contradictions within it that you have to see that eventually cause breaks, leaps, bounds, and eventually will transform capitalism into a new system. Accumulation is a relationship between constant capital and variable capital, and it all ultimately signifies that a big rise in wages impairs surplus value and therefore are always temporarily never that big, right? So what that means is wages can rise, but wages take away from how much moolah the capitalists get. So they may temporarily raise wages for a little bit. It may be nice for you, but it's never going to be permanent. The inverse is also true. A fall in productivity will mean a higher cost of labor power. So if somehow all the factories got destroyed and set back 20 years, labor power would cost a lot more for capitalists. Now, there are two kinds of labor, living labor and dead labor. Living labor is human labor power. It's the worker. He's alive. Dead labor is the value of past human workers transformed into the means of production, right? So constant capital. So capitalists will take living labor, your work, and use it to hire the thing that's going to replace you eventually, or the means of production around you, the factory around you. Under capitalism, because it's a competitive system, the value produced by living labor is used by capitalists to buy machines and more workers, to then get more value, then to buy more machines and hire more workers, right? So it's a never-ending cycle. It's that capital circuit. Because capitalism is a competition, quote, production does not take place to satisfy human need, but in order to enable one capitalist to survive in competition with another capitalist. The workers employed by each capitalist find their lives dominated by the drive of their employers to accumulate faster than their rivals. So let's look at those two major types of capital, constant capital and variable capital, right? Constant capital is the amount of capital invested in means of production, machinery, raw materials, apartment complexes, yada, yada. Variable capital is that capital spent on hiring out human labor, right? What goes towards wages. Variable capital is the only capital that can actually create new value, right? Human labor power can create new value. Constant capital cannot create new value. The machines hired out under capitalism, right? The robots, the factory machines, the tractors, they can only impart their pre-existing value onto the products, but they cannot create new value, right? So the rising organic composition of capital is a phenomenon where more and more money gets diverted into constant capital, machines, than variable capital, human labor power, right? Because you are taking money, you're often incentivized to become more productive because of competition. So more money gets spent into automating the workplace over human laborers. And even though humans are the major source of value, machines produce commodities so fast that capitalists can make up for the loss in value, which is offset by selling more products, right? So even though the product may be less value, you're able to produce 200 more, you're able to sell 200 more faster than your competition. As technology advancement leads to greater reliance on machinery over workers, this creates a generalized falling rate of profit because constant capital starts winning out over variable capital. So capitalism is a fight between machines and humans, right? Automation under capitalism is used to replace workers, is used to create more productivity. To put it another way, as capitalism becomes more automated, the amount of profit that capitalists are able to generate lowers because labor power itself becomes less involved within the process. Essentially, what happens is a capitalist gets a machine, right? Let's say across the entire industry, it takes 2 minutes to make a foot long, a Subway foot long. A capitalist gets a new doodad, right? That makes a foot long in half the time, a minute, right? He uses that. He's able to churn out foot long after foot long after foot long. He's able to invest a lot more capital into constant capital so he can let go of a couple workers, even though workers are the main source of value. He's able to churn out this foot long so fast that he's able to sell more and make up that value that he lost by firing those workers, right? Eventually, because capitalism is a competition, this new doodad that makes the footlongs twice as fast gets adopted across the entire industry, right? So all the Subway stores and all the competitors, Quiznos, yada yada, suddenly have this footlong making machine. Because capitalism has now invested more of its money into constant capital, right? This machine that can only impart its value onto the commodity than variable capital, right? This human labor power that's actually able to create value. The tendency of profit falls. The rate of profit falls. Why do capitalists do this? Radical new changes in technologies temporarily give them an edge over the competition. And whatever rates of profit they lose by not having labor involved, they're able to offset, right? Capitalism thinks both in short-term profits and also has effects in long-term. And they will sacrifice long-term for short-term overall. Capitalism is eating itself in this sense. The falling rate of profit is a ticking time bomb within capitalism. And also, what does the falling rate of profit mean, right? And constant capital, investing more money into constant capital it means capitalism is slowly but surely automating itself as much as physically possible. And capitalism is tending towards more and more automation. As we enter into our AI world and capitalists are budgeting over our heads, AI, you can see that constant fight between constant capital and variable capital right there. AI is being used as a way to lower people's wages, to threaten to fire them, et cetera, et cetera. Whether or not it can actually fire them, I don't believe so. But you can see that fight right there. Marx recognized that capitalism is not the only system in history that extracted surplus value from lower classes. However, what made capitalism unique was that it was done through exchange value, right? Which leads to some of the most overworking possible because of the endless seeking of profits, right? So, whereas peasants, which Marx points this out, didn't have their surplus value taken every single day, they only had it taken 56 days of the year. Only for 56 days of the year, peasants produce grain for taxes, right? Um, Under capitalism, we are constantly having to produce for the capital circuit, for exchange value, for commodities. And so this has led to an unnatural grind and shine work culture under capitalism that is extra exhaustive. You know, we don't get only 56 days of work. We get much more intense work every single day, nonstop. The way we work under capitalism is completely inhuman. Marx was also horrified, and you can see this all throughout Das Kapital, of child labor. And what was common at that time, very unsafe working conditions, 12 hours, people dying on the job, right? And child labor still exists to this day all over the world, right? He went on and on within Das Kapital about Victorian era capitalism, especially before the worker struggle got regulations, how kids worked up to 12 hours, how people were worked to death and how capitalism was slowly killing people or quickly killing people and taking years off their lives. And that's stuff that happens all the time under capitalism today. Kids still work under capitalism today. People still work to death and at the detriment of their health under capitalism today. Because to capitalism, all that matters is exploitation of as much surplus value as possible from their workers. There's no humanity to capitalism. There is no humanity to this mode of production. It does not care about humanity. All it cares about is the exchange value. You are part of that system. You are just seen as a machine that creates labor, that creates surplus value, that sells labor power. There is no humanity to capitalism. Capitalism has none. Stop looking for humanity within the system. The capitalist system is incentivized to see the worker as nothing but a machine of surplus value. The only reason that it doesn't completely make us work 24 hours a day is because it would be impossible. We would break down. We have some needs. Capital is also dead labor. It's capital using other people's past embodied labor to hire living labor. It's value stolen from past people's labor to buy new labor. In essence, capitalism is sort of like a society-wide Ponzi scheme, like Bernie Madoff, stuff like that, except society-wide. It's kind of crazy. They're paying off us with people's past labor that they're going to use to pay off for further future people's labor. Kind of crazy. In addition, this leads to workers existing to satisfy capital growth, not at all with the wealth of our societies being used for our own benefit. Wealth exists within our societies to satisfy capital and the capital circuit, not our own needs. All labor throughout human history has been a social phenomenon. Humans have never done any kind of work alone. The division of labor and technology. The division of labor is one of the oldest markings of human society, beginning as Marx and Engels noted with, the earliest Homo sapiens, right? I gather berries, you hunt. However, capitalism's cooperative nature and division of labor is a unique phenomenon never before seen in human history. Because before capitalism, under feudalism, you had craftsmen, tradespeople, who could make a whole product and were masters of their crafts, right? A shoe craftsman knew how to make a shoe from beginning to end. He developed those skills over decades, becoming an expert. However, under capitalism, masses of workers were put into big industrial warehouses, and rather than each worker knowing how to make the entire shoe from start to finish, they were divided into parts, division of labor, into the process of making that shoe along an assembly line, right? So one guy puts in the shoelaces, the other guy stitches the sole, the other guy stamps in the whatever, I don't know how to make a shoe, but you can get the idea. These workers have absolutely no knowledge of the rest of the product, nor do they own it. The fragmentation of labor turns humans into appendages of machines. The division of labor that happened under capitalism is entirely unique to the capitalist mode of production. This is important because Marx was a historical materialist. He traced how humans got to the modern situation. He also tried to use that to trace where humans were going. And it's one of the ironies of capitalism, right? Tools used to serve humans, right? And suddenly you got these machines that were able to run 24/7, these big industrial behemoths, and eventually humans, because of the capital circuit, because of exchange value, began serving our tools at our workplaces. So it's one of the ironies of capitalism. It's one of those things, something transforming into its opposite. Marx is a Hegelian, so he's going to look for those. Marx saw that with the growth of productive forces, right? Automation, machines, industry, means of production, the eventual class of society, we would have a breakdown of the division of labor. So once we got to communism, full communism, the breakdown of money, classes, etc., we would see a breakdown in the division of labor because we would be able to reach a point of automation so advanced and technological advancement so advanced that we wouldn't need these insular roles anymore, right? So you can imagine everything that you want about full communism, right? Luxury space brigade communism, Star Trek, etc., etc. It's very hard for us to imagine what it would look like. One of the cruelest developments within capitalism and the Industrial Revolution that Marx observed, that I went back to before, was that humans serve machines. Machines no longer serve humans, right? The industrial machines and behemoths have completely stripped workers of their skills, right? People used to be skilled worksmen. Now they no longer have any skills, right? Do you know how to build a house? I don't know how to build a house. A feudal peasant knew how to build a house. Do you know how to make a shoe? I don't know how to make a shoe. A feudal peasant knew how to make a shoe. All we know is how to put a lace into the shoe as it goes along the factory line. Quote, the machine, which is the starting point of the Industrial Revolution, supersedes the working man, who handles a single tool, by a mechanism operating with a number of similar tools and set in motion by a single mode of power, whatever that form may be, end quote. New technological innovation with the machinery are often advertised as lessening the workday, right? AI is going to make you work less. Phones are going to make you work less. Computers are going to make you work less. The internet's going to make you work less. The car is going to make you work less. These have all been said all throughout history. Marx even pulled up examples from ancient Greece with Greek slave owners saying, this new machine is going to make our slaves work a lot less, right? So Marx said that this trend goes back to a long time. But technological innovation under capitalism has always been about not lessening the workday, but extracting more surplus value out of workers, right? So once things get more productive, we don't get less work, we just get exploited more. Quote, like every other instrument for increasing the productivity of labor, machinery in capitalism is intended to cheapen commodities and, by shortening the part of the workday in which the worker works for himself, to lengthen the other part, the part he gives to the capitalist for nothing. The machine is a means for producing surplus value, end quote. We can see this right now, we can see this right now with AI. AI is being promised, you're going to work a lot less, yada, yada. Phone, same thing. We were promised so much, and yet we're still working 8 hours, It doesn't change. And of course, the fact that productivity has not kept up with wages in all these decades, especially since the 70s and the death of Keynesianism, shows you just how much of a bullshit line this is. At the heart of the relationship between workers and machines are two things: the reserve army of labor and the falling rate of profit. Right. So in that previous section, we talked about how constant capital and variable capital are always in a tug and pull. Machines and humans are always in a tug and pull under capitalism. Capitalism prefers slowly over time taking the value created by human labor and transferring it into industrial machines, automatons, automations, et cetera, et cetera. Well, as investing more capital into machines happens, then workers, this leads to a growing body of the reserve army of labor or unemployed people. Capitalism prefers to have a constant supply of unemployed people 24/7 because it makes negotiating wages with other workers easier. You know, your boss can completely fuck you over if there's a guy that's hungry, that's standing outside, that's homeless, that's so desperate for work that he's able to accept half the work that you're doing because all he needs is food. The second fundamental idea that this leads to, that I alluded to before, is a falling rate of profit. What's the main source of value? Human labor power, right? Human labor power. Machines cannot create value. They can only impart the value that they have onto the commodity, right? So let's say there's a burger making machine that will last 20 years, right? Over 20 years, it'll slowly break down. Every time it makes a new burger, it takes 5 seconds off its lifespan. When it does that, it imparts its value onto the burger, right? It imparts its value onto the burger. It's not creating new value within this process. What generally happens under capitalism is a new machine is introduced and a company adopts it. That company sees record profits, right? It's able to produce commodities faster than ever. The commodities may have less value because there's less socially necessary labor time to make them, but they're producing them so fast that they're able to sell way more and offset that loss in profits to make more profits, right? Eventually, this new automaton, this new innovation gets adopted across the entire industry, and because human labor power is the only source of value, this causes rates of profit to fall. This is a ticking time bomb within capitalism. The more we automate and innovate, the more automatic capitalism becomes, the less human labor power is involved in it, the less profits can be made with capitalism. Now, you may be saying, well, you know, the market does self-correct after it hires out machines, right? You know, after the internet age, it put out a lot of people out of work, but it did self-correct eventually. Yes, Marx acknowledged that, but he said that it happens asynchronously, right? It happens not fast enough. The market is so anarchistic that it takes forever. And in fact, not everybody thrown into the reserve army of labor gets rehired when it readjusts, right? It happens at a rate so slowly, these market readjustments, whenever new products and machines are made, that it does not keep up with human need. Like, people starve in the meantime. And not everybody eventually gets reintegrated into the market. Why do capitalists do all of this if it's leading to a falling rate of profit? Short-term, quarterly profits. The short-term always outweighs the long-term under capitalism. That is another tug and pull under capitalism. Here you need to understand also the idea of absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. Absolute surplus value is the surplus value made by increasing somebody's workday, right? So capitalism likes to do this during its early stages, right? In the Victorian era, people work 12 hours, 16 hours, insane hours, 18 hours I've even seen sometimes, which, dude, blow up the factory. Like, Jesus fucking Christ. If I had to work 18 hours a day, I would genuinely, you know? Like, Jesus fucking Christ. Anyways, so that's absolute surplus value. That's what capitalism prefers at first. And it scrapes off the rest of the value, by making it work more. Relative surplus value is what capitalism tends to do as it gets more advanced, right? Relative surplus value is surplus value that it can get by making workers more productive, right? So even though and by introducing new machines, right? So even though commodities may be coming out faster, which makes them less valuable, you're able to sell so much more that you can sort of offset that. So that's relative surplus value, right? So when capitalism finally exhausts lengthening the workday as much as possible, it's forced to adopt relative surplus value, which soon begins, as Marx said, to, quote, conquer all important branches, end quote. So relative surplus value becomes the new king, which is just making workers productive as possible, which is just automating the process as much as possible. By making workers able to produce commodities faster, even though their value lowers, companies are able to sell more product on the market, etc., etc. The contradiction between constant capital and variable capital also leads to an opposite reaction within capitalism, and that is hiring workers at much lower wages, rather than implementing in machines that could increase productivity and increase people's life quality and lessen their work, right? So sometimes there's new groundbreaking innovations within the industry that can make our lives easier, that are purposely not integrated into the workplace. Because, again, human labor power is the source of value. So capitalists sometimes will prefer having human labor power and not innovating and not making the workplace more productive up until industry and constant capital and these productive forces are so productive that they offset the amount of money they would lose by not hiring you, right? So by not hiring more workers. So capitalism essentially is incentivized not to innovate keep the productive forces of new machines out of work as long as possible, only until it becomes more profitable to buy the new machines over workers' wages, right? So, if a new machine costs $300,000, you only cost $20,000, um, and the machine is only able to produce, $10,000 worth of value. The capitalist is not going to hire it up until it is able to produce way more than you, and therefore is able to make um, a lot more of a profit. Under socialism, more productive machines and things like that would be implemented in right away. Exchange value doesn't matter, et cetera, doesn't matter. You can work a lot less, et cetera, et cetera. Arpam Dutt in Social Fascism or Revolution illustrated how capitalism actually held back productivity perfectly when he talked about fascist Germany's glassblowing industries. So basically in the 1930s, there was all this amazing innovation within the glassblowing industries that drastically cut down on the amount of time to create glass. But instead of actually implementing them, German manufacturers purposely held on to older technologies and just continued to employ people at lower wages. The Soviet Union, however, immediately bought all the newest machines that increased productivity from the United States and even German manufacturers. Constant capital, reproduction, and globalization. Marx noted that workers under capitalism become slaves to machines, not the other way around, where machines are slaves to us. Marx even touched on how commodification of agriculture, with machines a burden, both led to kicking out of peasants and turning them into workers. It also led to soil exhaustion of nutrients, which is an ongoing problem that we are still facing to some extent, depletion of arable soil. Marx within Capital, therefore, did one of the earliest environmental critiques, way before even ecology was fully understood, because, again, crops are used for, and land is used for exchange value, not use value. Produce as much fucking corn as you can, sell as much as you can, and then throw the rest away while people starve. It's not that complicated, though, overall. Agriculture and soil are just used for exchange value. This leads to overconsumption at unsustainable rates. Oceans full of trash, ecosphere polluted, eco collapse, and the machine of capitalism keeps trucking along, even though we are at a point where we are producing more than enough commodities to feed everybody on Earth. But we have to keep on feeding the cycle because that is all that matters, the commodity circuit, not actually serving human needs. Marx divided labor into different kinds. The first kind of labor was productive labor. This has no emotional or moral attribute. It's just a name, right? And it's productive for capitalists, right? That is why he called it productive labor. It is in the eyes of the capitalist that's productive. Productive labor is just labor that produces surplus value for a capital circuit. Now, Marx had a very broad definition of productive labor. He even used the example of a teacher hired by a private school. And I'll explain why private school matters later on very soon, as a productive labor. So anybody telling you that like a barista at Starbucks is not a productive laborer is bullshitting you. There's a certain party that does that a lot. Unproductive labor is labor that does not go to produce surplus value for capital or its circuit, right? So public school teachers are not productive labor. They are unproductive labor. Government officials are unproductive labor. People who work for the county, people who work for the state. A small shopkeeper who is the only sole owner and the only sole employee, he is unproductive labor, right? He only produces value for himself. He does not produce value for the capital circuit. A doctor at a public hospital, right? So a doctor at a nationalized public hospital in a country with free health insurance. These are all unproductive labor. Labor that is unproductive in the eyes of capitalists is horrible. It is taking away from the surplus value. It is taking away from the capital circuit, right? So that is why capitalists are so often incentivized to privatize everything. Any labor that is unproductive is labor that is not giving them surplus value. There's one small sentence in Das Kapital that caught my eye because it explains globalization, sweatshops. Marx himself did not fully understand this phenomenon either, though. Quote, just as the individual labor can do more surplus labor in proportion as his necessary labor time is less, so with regard to the working population, the smaller part of the which it is required for the production of the necessary means of subsistence, so much greater is the part that can be set off to do other work. Basically, what Marx is saying here is that in underdeveloped economies, here he's specifically talking about Egypt, people need less necessary labor or wages because their economies are so much cruder and people's lives are so much simpler, right? Their needs are a lot less. So they need a lot less necessary labor, so a lot more surplus labor can be taken, right? So a peasant worker who lives in a shanty town in Egypt or India or Mexico needs a lot less basic needs, necessary labor, lower wages, and can produce more absolute surplus value or profit for his capitalist. And of course, these people do deserve much more, but capitalism is not a thinking machine. It reproduces these conditions and takes advantage of them. And this is because capitalism is hypermobile. It can choose places where it can set up at the lowest necessary costs of labor. Right, so think of globalization, where all the factory jobs got moved from America to China, Sri Lanka, etc., etc. In addition, Marx points out that there are vast differences across nations with their wages. Marx was writing before the rest of the world had industrialized, so he assumed that capitalism would prefer the more developed economies, right? So Marx actually, that's the one thing that Marx got wrong. Marx actually predicted that capital would prefer to stay in the more highly developed countries because that's where they can exploit workers the most. And this is because more productivity for capitalists makes the ratio between wages and surplus value profitable for them, right? However, what Marx failed to predict, and this is one of his genuine failing to predict, was that industrialization would go around all over the world and would lead to almost equal rates of productivity all over the world, while nominal wages within lesser developed economies remain lower, making globalization more profitable. Basically, what Marx failed to predict was that eventually factories in Cambodia would become just as productive as factories in Michigan, but Cambodian workers would have less necessary labor time required for their upkeep compared to workers within Michigan. And so capitalists would prefer to move all of their operations there. But Marx predicted a lot of things, so that's not that bad of a loss. Like one for one, he's out 1 for 1, but he's not doing that bad. So again, labor power is a commodity in capitalism. You sell it to a capitalist, you get a wage in return. And that's the basic relation, right? The capitalist owns the means of production. The only thing you own is your body. You sell your labor power, you get a wage in return. That's the basic social relation in capitalism. Marx had to abstract labor power from labor. Labor is actually doing it. Labor power is your ability to do work. Um, it has value through the amount of time it takes to train a person. That is also a major source of it, the amount of time it takes to train you for that work. So a neurosurgeon goes to medical school, he has a lot more socially necessary labor time in order to do labor and produce his commodity, which is labor power, than a guy who works at a poop factory. I don't know, some shitty job, 7-Eleven, something like that. And that's not to give a moralistic judgment on either of these people. Both of their labor is valuable to society. And it is just to say that under capitalism, this is how it is treated. So traditional economics in this sense is like voodoo economics, right? Because it refuses to look deeper than market supply and demand. This is why so many of Marx's predictions, despite the previous one we mentioned, have come true, because he is focusing on true value, whose source is socially necessary labor time, not supply, not demand, not other mystifications that capitalists give us. Marx pointed out another way you're getting fucked in capitalism. You as the worker are the major source of value in most commodities. And even though you make the product, it gets taken away from you. Some of the value that you produced is taken by the capitalist, and you have to rebuy the very products you made on the market, right? So I make a PS5. I don't get the damn PS5. The capitalist takes my surplus value. I get some necessary I did some necessary labor, so I get some wages. I have to buy back the PS5 that I made from surplus value the capitalist took. It's such a Ponzi scheme, and Marx pointed that out. It's you're being ripped off in every single way under capitalism. Money and commodities, therefore, obscure human relations of exploitation right in front of our eyes. To Marx, capitalism and its class society was a system that reproduced itself. The worker created the capitalist through not only working for capitalists, but also buying commodities that they owned. The capitalist produced wage laborers in this sense also. Quote, the laborer, therefore, constantly produces material, objective wealth, but in the form of capital, of alien labor power that dominates and exploits him. And the capitalist as constantly producing labor power, but in the form of subjective source of wealth, separated from the objects in which and by why it can alone be realized. In short, he produces the labor, but as a wage laborer, end quote. And also, quote, the capitalist profits not only by what he receives from, but what he gives to the laborer. The capital given in exchange for labor power is converted into necessaries, by consumption of which the muscles, nerves, bones, and brains of existing laborers is produced and reproduced, and new laborers are begotten, end quote. What Marx is saying is that capitalists and workers reproduce more workers and more capitalists through the never-ending cycle of the circuit that is capital, CMC, commodity, money, commodity. Capitalism often tends to bring wages below the actual value of labor power so that the rest of the value can be used for accumulation of capital. Because wages don't rise in proportion with productivity, an increase of productivity leads to a higher rate of surplus value. Even if wages do rise a little, they're often not at the same rate as productivity. And one of the few times that wages were somewhat tied to productivity was Keynesianism, but you couldn't do that forever. That was a relation of capital where capitalists eventually would want more surplus value, would need more surplus value because of falling rates of profit, et cetera, et cetera. As accumulation increases, capitalists don't have to put all their money into the capital circuit, right? So during the beginning of capital, capitalists' entire money is spent constantly circulating, constantly reinvesting into capital, constantly reinvesting into new factories. As capital grows, as capital accumulates, they can start spending money on nice things. And we've gotten to a point in capitalism where they're able to spend money on very, very nice things for themselves. Yachts, helicopters, space rides, SpaceX's, rocket ships to Mars. Jeff Bezos can buy himself a shot to Mars. Early capitalists, when industrialism was first starting, they were solely focused on the bag, right? They were solely focused on industry. They were solely focused on getting industry. But as it develops more and more, less money can be put into the capital circuit, and you can siphon off that money into your bank account. Once that money is put into a capitalist bank account and not used to produce more value, it's no longer capital. It's just his personal money. All right. So that goes into yachts, golden toilets, space trips, whatever the fuck the rich spend their money on. I don't know. Capitalism is so fucking stupid, man. Not even the capitalists seem happy under it. Like, Jeff Bezos seems miserable half the time. Elon Musk seems miserable half the time. What the fuck are we doing this for? All right, that's enough. That's enough. It's 2 a.m. That's enough existential crises. Monopolization and the reserve army of labor as a tool. Marx also expertly broke down the libertarian argument that, the free market doesn't tend towards monopolization. If you leave the free market alone enough, all these companies will get into an equilibrium of competition. What stupid fucking bullshit. Marx said the free market, whenever it enters a new industry, is a competition of many capitals, right? There's like a bunch of guys, whenever a new industry blooms, a bunch of guys all fighting each other, right? Think of the smartphone industry. Nokia, Apple, BlackBerry, Android. Eventually, since capitalism is a competition, one capital or a handful of capitals triumph over all others, and they amass the capital of the others, right? We went from Nokia, BlackBerry, iPhone, Android to just iPhone and Android. Quote, the smaller capitals therefore crowd into spheres of production, which modern industries has only sporadically or incompletely gotten hold of. Here, competition rages into direct proportion to the number and inverse proportion to the magnitudes of the antagonistic capitals. It always ends in the ruin of many small capitalists, whose capitals partly pass into the hands of their conquerors and partly vanish, end quote. So yeah, it's a competition. People win the competition, people lose the competition, the winners become monopolies. It's not fucking rocket science, libertarians. Stop with your bullshit. I don't know. Competition within the free market is not a tool against centralization, but it is a tool of centralization. Competition within the free market doesn't lead to no monopolies. It leads to the monopolies. It is the source of monopolies, competition. That's what Marx is trying to point out to you. Marx defines accumulation as the building up of the capitalist relationship, right? Workers who own nothing but their own bodies, who sell their labor power, and capitalists who own the means of production. And centralization as the merger of his capitals into monopolies. So accumulation is creation of the capital relation. Centralization is monopolization, basically. Tyson Foods, PepsiCo. What other monopolies are there? Amazon? Disney? Oh, Disney is a huge monopoly. Holy shit, I can't believe I forgot Disney. God damn. Pretty soon Disney's even going to own the Poke Pre podcast. That's how it's going to go. Just you wait. The mouse is going to get me one of these days. I'm gonna become a slave of Mickey Mouse. Yep. He's gonna own everything. Anyways, the reserve army of labor is not only a source of unemployed people, but also, as far as capitalists are concerned, a surplus, unnecessary population of human beings. As far as capitalism is concerned, unemployed people are people within the reserve army of labor way down the system. In that sense, once capitalism has reached its full extent, once it has completely reached its tentacles into all over the world, once it has really automated the productive forces and built up productive forces, and once, thanks to imperialism and globalization, it has gotten universally pertinent all over the world, it is not a progressive force. It becomes a weight on humanity. It becomes hyper-centralized, monopolized. It casts entire populations of the human race into the reserve army of labor. Many Palestinians right now are in the reserve army of labor. Many Sudanese people right now are in the reserve army of labor. It begins to see these reserve army of labor as human beings that weigh on it like an anchor, like a tool of misery that leads to war, fascism, etc., exterminations. The reserve army of labor is where Malthusianism came from, right? Malthus had this idea that the human race could not support extra people, and Malthus really mystified the relations that created this, right? The struggle between constant capital and variable capital. And Malthus's ideas, Malthusianism, led to the exporting of grain when Bengal and Ireland were having their famines, because these were reserve army of labors. These were surplus populations that capitalism no longer deemed worthy of living. And so millions starved within Bengal and Ireland combined. And Ireland has never recovered from that population drip. Damn. RIP. That sucks. Holy shit. No wonder the Irish are always so angry at the English. No wonder they created the IRA. Holy shit. Damn. I understand now. I understood anyways. I'm already Indian. Anyways, one part of the working class overworks and is squeezed of value. The other part of the working class doesn't work at all. That is what capitalism is. One part of the working class cannot find work no matter how much desperately it tries. The other part is squeezed out of as much value as it can get. Imagine work under socialism. Everybody is able to contribute to society. Everybody is employed, or even we can abolish the concept of work itself. We can work much less hours because we don't have to spend as much time creating surplus value. We can clock into work for 4 hours, and productive machines actually reduce our workday. I mean, it would be a wonderful world that we unfortunately are not able to live in because of the relations of production and the current system that we have. Marx mentions capitalism's relationship with population sizes. Quote, in fact, not only the number of births and deaths, but the absolute size of the family stand in inverse to the height of wages, and therefore to the amount of the means of subsistence of which different categories of laborers dispose. This law of capitalist society would sound absurd to savages, or even civilized colonists. It calls to mind the boundless reproduction of animals, individually weak and constantly hunted down, end quote. Basically, more people equals lower wages, more unemployed people who are deemed undesirable by capitalists in the meat grinder of the system. And also, capitalism has an up and down bipolar sort of relationship with population sizes. When it needs more workers for surplus value and more workers for human labor power, it emphasizes people to create more babies. It says create more babies, create more babies. Elon Musk is always doing that. People need to have more babies, but that's part of his weird white agenda also. But he also wants more workers to extract surplus value out of. And then when it has a too large reserve army of labor, when too much capital has been put into constant capital, and it's created a large reserve army of labor, unemployed people, it says stop having babies, stop having babies, stop having kids. So capitalism sometimes wants us to have kids so that it can exploit them and get that surplus value out of our kids as workers, and sometimes it wants us to stop having kids. With regards to the reserve army of labor, Marx mentions that capital will intervene within the market through state interference, putting aside its god, supply and demand, in order to course correct for the reserve army of labors that it creates. So capitalism is not above intervening within the market through the state, through regulations. This means that the state intervention, the regulations that libertarians often call Marxists, were anticipated by Marx himself to preserve capitalism. This is because capitalism naturally creates accumulation of wealth at one pole, and therefore at the same time accumulation of misery, agony, and toil of slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation at the opposite pole. That is what Marx said, basically. And as Marx said, the millions that go hungry in the richest nations, they don't suffer from privation. They suffer from privation of the capitalists. All this abstinence that they have is from the means of subsistence absolutely necessary for mere vegetation of his hands, right? So Marx is saying that basically two things, right? Capitalism throws a lot of people into the surplus population that is no longer required, right? This dredge population that it no longer cares about. And a lot of these people end up in the lumpen proletariat, right? Illegal work, right? Prostitution, gangs, et cetera, et cetera. Crime, et cetera, et cetera. And it seeks to get rid of this population, right? That's what he's saying. And he's also saying capitalism causes misery, mass misery for people on one end while it accumulates capital for itself on the other. And that doesn't really need to be explained to most people. I feel like most people already know that inherently. Marx also noted that people's wages at the time that he was writing it couldn't keep up with costs of apartments. People couldn't afford a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment. Does it sound familiar to anybody else? Marx also wrote about gentrification. He wrote about how specific sides of town are bought up, poor people are kicked out of them, and they're sort of like renovated. Marx was on the top of a lot of things, honestly. Does mass killing, or in the modern day deportation, permanently get rid of the reserve army of labor? So a lot of the times, right now, a lot of people are saying like, let's deport the Mexicans, right? Let's deport the migrants, so that we can have more jobs for ourselves. Marx pointed out that doesn't work. That does not work. Capitalism produces the reserve army of labor, or the unemployed people, in proportion to the population that it has. So Marx points out, even though 1 million people died in Ireland, there were still unemployed people. The reserve army of labor is proportional to the population that you have. So you get rid of all the Mexicans or the migrants or whatever. The unemployment will just shift to whatever portion of population that we have. It'll just be percentage wise to the proportion of population that we have. In addition, quote, the wages are just as low. That oppression of the labor has increased. That misery is forcing the country towards a new crisis. That's what he's saying about Ireland, basically. That Ireland's wages are absurdly low. So no, killing people or deporting people does not make your wages higher. That doesn't. That's what a lot of libertarians and conservatives and Trumpers are thinking right now. Primitive accumulation, force, and ideology. We are often told by libertarian types that capitalism is consensual, that we signed this contract to work, that we can break at any time. However, nobody agreed to be in that contract. And as Marx pointed out, capitalism required this thing called primitive accumulation in order to create itself. So capitalism often tells a story about how capitalism was birthed. It often tells itself, there were these people who were super smart, they accumulated wealth, and there were very stupid people who were not very smart, and they became workers, and they didn't get that much wealth. Marx says, no, capitalism's birth actually required, quote, conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, briefly force, play at the great part. And as a matter of fact, the methods of primitive accumulation are anything but idyllic, end quote. Primitive accumulation is the creation of two classes with commodities. One is a capitalist who owns all the means of production, and the other is a free worker, right? A worker who has no private property and who only has one single commodity left: labor power, their ability to do work, which they sell to the capitalists in exchange for wages. In order to do this and create free workers, laborers had to have all property taken away from them. So they're desperate enough and mobile enough to become a free worker that sells their labor power. As Marx said, quote, "But on the other hand, these new freedmen became sellers of themselves only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production," end quote. And as Marx said, quote, "In the history of primitive accumulation, all revolutions are epoch-making that act as levers for the capitalist class in the course of formation. But above all, those moments when great masses of men are suddenly and forcibly torn from their means of subsistence and hurled free and unattached proletarians on the labor market," end quote. So what Marx is saying is, we had a system called feudalism, right? You had peasants in feudalism. Peasants worked on these small farms. They had a little bit of land. They had a little bit of commons. Capitalism had to get rid of all that private property that peasants had, make them free landless laborers so that they could sell the labor power to the capitalists. What did capitalism look like historically, right? What did primitive accumulation, the creation of capitalism out of feudalism, look like historically? Marx traced it in the enslavement of Native Americans, the discovery of gold in the New World, the colonialism in the East Indies, the enslavement of Africans, the opium wars in China. Quote, "The treasures captured outside of Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder floated back to the mother country and were there turned into capital," end quote. In England, primitive accumulation, or the creation of the capitalist relation out of feudalism, that's basically what it is, another way to put it. It looked like authorities closing the commons. The commons were farmlands that peasants could farm on. Anybody could farm on. And even the farmland that the peasants lived on. Peasants were kicked out of the countryside so that these could be turned into sheep pastures, so that sheep could be put there, so that early English capitalists could then use the wool from the sheep to make clothes, textiles, etc. People were literally forced and made landless for sheep. This forced peasants out of the countryside, made them landless, and put their landlords into a class position of power, and created big company farms. As one defender of the closing of commons said, quote, "If by converting the little farms into body of men who must work for others, more labor is produced, it is an advantage to the nation," end quote. So it was a very deliberate process, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and stripping peasants of their land and private property, entering them into free laborers. Sometimes whole peasant villages would be burnt by armies, English armies. Marx talks about one old woman who was burnt to death by the flames of the hut that she was living in because she refused to leave. For peasants who were thrown off of their land, manufacturers didn't have enough jobs for them always, right? So there's more landless peasants than there are actual jobs. So what happened? Vagabond laws would be created. These would punish the jobless. They would put them into slavery. They would imprison them. They would flog them publicly. So capitalism, when it was being created out of feudalism, literally stripped these people of their land, threw them into the towns, right? They have no more peasant homes anymore. The peasant homes have been turned into sheep pastures for sheep to graze on. And then when they came to cities and were unable to find jobs, it punished them further and imprisoned them and turned them into effective slaves. Today, we still have vagabond laws in a very similar process with our reserve army labor through anti-homeless laws, which have been passed all over America, all over the world. Capitalism does not shed its disastrous things very easily. And the way Marx is able to predict the future is so amazing, honestly. And he's not even predicting the future. He's just noticing trends that existed around him at that time that never got fixed because capitalism still exists. As Marx said, primitive accumulation and the slavery, genocides, colonialism, and peasant expropriations that it required makes capital, quote, "come dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt," end quote. So capitalism is a very bloody process in order to be created. Once capitalism is in place, and capitalism is very bloody in general. It's always bloody. It's always bloody. I don't know why I said in the beginning. Once capital is in place, it creates a system in which it seems like for workers that they voluntarily sell their labor power. So that whole contract thing, once capitalism is in place, it mystifies itself. It makes it almost seem like you're voluntarily doing it. You're voluntarily getting exploited. Exploitation under capitalism is especially mystified under the free market, where you're fighting with other people for a job. It seems as though it's your own individual responsibility. The working class is taught to assume that the relation it finds itself in has always existed, right? This wage labor has always existed. Wage labor has not always existed, right? The majority of labor before was either slave labor or feudal labor, which was, paying taxes and grain or stuff that you produced on your land to your noblemen. So this specific mode of production that we find ourselves in is only temporary. As Marx pointed out with primitive accumulation, it was created out of feudalism and was deliberately created and will go somewhere. Marx summarizes all of Capital Volume 1 with this very long quote, which I will read for you. Quote, The advancement of capitalist production develops a working class, but which by education, tradition, habit, looks upon the conditions of that mode of production as self-evident laws of nature. The organization of the capitalist process of production, once fully developed, breaks down all resistance. The constant generation of a relative surplus population keeps the law of supply and demand of labor, and therefore keeps wages in a rut that corresponds with the wants of capital. The dull compulsion of economic relations completes the subjection of labor to the capitalist. Direct force outside of economic conditions is of course still used, but only exceptionally. In the ordinary run of things, the laborer can be left to the natural laws of production, to his dependence on capital, a dependence springing from and guaranteed in perpetuity by the condition of production themselves. It is otherwise during the historic genesis of capitalist production. The bourgeoisie, at its rise, wants and uses the power of the state to regulate wages, to force them within the limits suitable for surplus value making, to lengthen the working day, and to keep the laborer himself in normal degree of dependence. This is an essential element of the so-called primitive accumulation, end quote. My final thoughts on capital and the final parts of capital. Capital, commodity production, classes, and money have all existed long before capitalism to some degree or another, right? Crude commodity production did exist before capitalism under feudalism. Capital itself, such as constant capital, right, means of production, did exist before capitalism itself under feudalism through, guild masters' houses and guild masters' guilds. But capitalism has simplified them and brought them to an unprecedented level of development. In doing so, capitalism has allowed humanity for the first time to break away from class society and money forever, if it can overthrow capitalism for good. Capitalism has simplified class society. It has only created two classes, really main classes, capitalists and proletariat. There are subclasses in between, but these are two main classes and it hurled the majority of humanity into them. It's centralized production. It's made a system that is ever global and centralized and, globe-trotting. It has created the conditions for a new world better than the ones before, better than feudalism, better than capitalism itself, called socialism. Capital, as embodied labor, is transformed from nation to nation through credit, bank loans, and national debt. Okay? A great deal of capital, which appears today in the United States without any certificate of birth, was yesterday in England the capitalized blood of children. That's what Marx said. What Marx is essentially saying is that bank loans, national debt, credit, these are all important parts of the capitalist process. There's this really great book, and they're all representations of past labor. There's this really great book by Rebecca Hall called Wake, where she illustrates her time in England researching these big insurance companies that became enormously rich through the African slave trade. And even though I'm not entirely a mathematician, I wonder how much of the capital available today circulating within human society, our society, American and British, embodies that long dead slave labor, or that long dead labor from the slave process, or value created from the slave trading process. Marx noted that within colonies such as America, and this is completely time specific, Marx noted that the capital relation within the early American Republic was much harder to establish since laborers had a lot more resources available, right? Laborers within America had a lot more freedom since they had a lot more resources available to them. Why on earth would they need to sell their labor power to capitalists? You can get a large plot of land. You can get a lot of resources within America within the early colonial period that you stole from Native Americans. I think this explains a lot about American culture, why our idea of capitalism is so mystified. We're still under those old notions of colonial freedom that a lot of laborers were given. As Marx said, quote, "The essence of a free colony, on contrary, consists in this, that the bulk of the soil is still public property, and every settler on it, therefore, can turn in part his private property and individual means of production." So, you just get a lot of freedom in American society, colonial societies, that is to the opposition of the establishment of capitalism itself. Marx basically uses the colonies example, early American Republic, to prove that capital is not just money sitting in a bank, but a tool of social relation. Capital has to be in constant circulation, where laborers are stripped of all means, all private property, and are forced to sell their labor power to a capitalist in exchange for a wage. And it was a lot harder to establish in America, basically. But eventually, Marx said it was established, especially after the American Civil War. National debt, Marx said, is a fundamental part of primitive accumulation. Marx argued that since governments are able to issue bonds are just little certificates that you're able to buy that grow in value. Capitalists can buy these bonds and get assured capital from the government without doing anything, right? So very wealthy people end up buying government bonds, especially during market recessions, and they don't do shit. They're just parasites. They just sit there collecting the bonds growing, which the government gives them, without building factories, without building anything. This leads to parasitism, because who is paying the bonds of the capitalists? Workers. We're getting taxed to pay the bonds of capitalists. And Marx even said that heavy taxes make the working class more complacent. So it's kind of incentivized to do it. So in fact, Marx said that heavy taxes lead to complacency. So Marx was anti-tax. libertarians. Take that. He wasn't anti-tax. He was just observing a law under capitalism. He didn't really care pro-tax, anti-tax. Well, actually, he did advocate for a tax, an income tax in the Communist Manifesto. So take it as you will. National debt then just becomes a way to funnel money from poor people through taxes to rich people. That's all you need to understand. American national debt, those trillions of dollars, that's just us paying taxes to rich people who get money through government bonds and other various subsidies from the government. National debt is just money going from poor people to rich people within every single nation. Banks were also guaranteed the privilege of being able to print money, which gave them unmeasurable power. So that was also an important part of primitive accumulation. Capitalism's life cycle is essentially a series of transformations into the opposite. Capitalism begins and it transforms feudal society from a communal one into an individualistic one, based on individualistic productions. This individualistic production under early capitalism then gets centralized as capitalism becomes monopolized, right? It creates class conflict by hurling the majority of humanity into the proletariat and a few pieces of humanity into the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class. Capitalism then allows for the final transformation of capitalism into its opposite, as it becomes a centralized, globalized, monopolized system, socialism, right? From private ownership to communal ownership once again. Capitalism is birthing the socialist mode of production through its very existence and life cycle without realizing it. A better world is possible. Marx within Das Kapital proved that capitalism was only a temporary phase of humanity with its own laws, many contradictions, and progressive elements, along with many regressive elements. Capitalism does have some progressive elements, but eventually it becomes regressive. It becomes an impediment on the human race, and it's long since become that. It's no longer progressive whatsoever. Don't let anybody fool you, any revisionists fool you that we need some sort of state capitalism. Everything within the system of capital is a tug and pull, right? So these are the big lessons of capital, Das Kapital. Everything within the system of capital are tug and pull. Necessary labor versus surplus labor. Exchange value versus use value. The reserve army of labor versus the entire system. All of these are tugs and pulls. And eventually, you will have these contradictions break and transform into their opposites, which is a new stage of humanity that we all call socialism. Let the ruling classes tremble at communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Karl Marx, Chapter 4 of Das Kapital. Thank you for listening to the Book Your Brief podcast. If you want to support our podcast, you can always head down to our Patreon, where you can get episodes up to a month early. Workers of the world unite. Long live the immortal science of Marxist-Leninism. Thank you.